Welcome to the Medical Software Consulting channel. The explainer video will now begin.
Welcome to this essential overview of ISO 14971. This is the international standard for risk management of medical devices. In this video, we will explain the key concepts, the main process steps, and some practical examples. Whether you are a software engineer, a regulatory professional, or a startup founder, this guide will help you understand how ISO 14971 applies to your work. Let me explain the concept of risk in ISO 14971, Application of Risk Management to Medical Devices. To illustrate this diagram, I will use an example that is not software-related but is easy to understand: spilling hot water from an electric kettle. This diagram shows the sequence from the top. A hazard, which is the potential source of harm, leads through a sequence of events to a hazardous situation and then finally to actual harm. In the kettle example, the hazard and the potential source of harm is the hot water, in other words, the thermal energy. A sequence of events might occur. Someone trips over the power cord, the lid opens, and hot water is spilled. This is the hazardous situation. However, being in a hazardous situation alone does not yet mean that harm has occurred. Harm occurs when someone touches the spilled hot water and suffers a burn injury. In this model, the probability that the sequence of events occurs and leads to a hazardous situation is called P1. The probability that the hazardous situation actually results in harm is P2. The overall probability of harm is determined by considering both P1 and P2, together with the severity of the potential harm. ISO 14971 defines risk as the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. In the case of software, it is often difficult to clearly identify the hazard, the potential source of harm. However, it is not difficult to imagine that if software malfunctions, it could lead from a hazardous situation to actual harm. Safety is defined as the absence of unacceptable risk. One of the most widely used references is ISO/IEC Guide 51. Although this guide was revised in 2014, the 1999 edition gives a very clear explanation of the concept of safety, and I'd like to introduce that here. According to Guide 51, safety means that unacceptable risks do not exist. In other words, being safe means being free from risks that cannot be accepted or that acceptable risks have been achieved. It's important to understand that safety is defined through risk, and risk itself changes over time depending on society, conditions, and the environment. Because of this, the level of safety can never be fixed, and absolute safety cannot be defined. Products, processes, or services can only be described as being relatively safe. Safety is achieved by reducing risk to an acceptable level, and what is acceptable is determined by balancing many factors, such as user convenience, fitness for purpose, cost-effectiveness, and the customs of the society involved. This is why acceptable risk must always be reviewed. When technology and knowledge advance, and when improvements become economically feasible, products and processes must be re-evaluated so that risks can be reduced even further. Let's summarize the key points about safety. First, safety means that unacceptable risks do not exist. Second, absolute safety cannot be defined. Safety is always a relative concept. Third, whether a risk is acceptable depends on a balance of factors, such as user convenience, fitness for purpose, and cost-effectiveness. Fourth, as technology advances, the acceptability of risks must be re-evaluated. Because safety is relative, we can never say that something is absolutely safe. For example, nuclear power plants were once considered safe. Yet during the Great East Japan earthquake, the combination of the quake and tsunami led to a major accident. On the other hand, some risks that were once uncontrollable may become controllable as technology progresses. Likewise, risk control measures that were once too costly may become feasible as costs decrease. This is why risk management does not end at the time of product release. It must be continuously reviewed and updated in response to new knowledge, new technology, and changing conditions. Now let's look at the risk management process defined in ISO 14971. Medical device manufacturers are required to establish, implement, document, and maintain a series of processes to A. Identify hazards and hazardous situations related to the device. B. Estimate and evaluate the associated risks. C. Implement risk control. And D. Monitor the effectiveness of the risk control measures. This process must be applied throughout the entire life cycle of the medical device. In practice, as shown in the flow diagram, the process begins with risk analysis and risk evaluation, followed by risk control. Then, manufacturers must evaluate the overall residual risk, conduct a risk management review, and carry out production and post-production activities. Risk analysis and risk evaluation together are called risk assessment, and when combined with all other activities, they form the complete risk management process. It's also important to note that all of this must be carried out under a risk management plan. Here are some key points of risk assessment. First, as mentioned earlier, you must define the intended use of the device, and this definition must be documented. Even if a situation results from user misuse, if it is reasonably foreseeable misuse, it must be clarified and included in the risk analysis. Next, identify the safety characteristics of the device. These are the characteristics that could impact safety. For guidance, ISO/TR 24971 provides a useful list of questions. Based on intended use, reasonably foreseeable misuse, and the safety characteristics, you must identify all known and foreseeable hazards, both in normal and fault conditions, and document them. For each hazardous situation identified, you must estimate the risk. If it's not possible to estimate the probability of occurrence, you should at least list the possible outcomes. For the methods of qualitative or quantitative risk estimation, both in terms of probability and severity, ISO/TR 24971 again provides detailed guidance. Finally, each hazardous situation must be evaluated against the acceptability criteria defined in the risk management plan to determine whether the risk is acceptable or not. This structured process ensures that risk management is not a one-time activity, but a continuous and documented practice across the entire product lifecycle. Now, let's look at an example of qualitative risk analysis. This table shows a 5x5 risk matrix. On the horizontal axis, we have the severity of the potential harm. On the vertical axis, we have levels of probability for the risk to occur. Each organization defines its own acceptability criteria for risks placed on this matrix. In this example, the red zone represents risks that are unacceptable. The yellow zone shows risks that require further consideration of risk control, and the green zone represents risks that are insignificant or negligible. The degree of severity can also be defined as shown in the table on the right-hand side. As for the probability levels, these may sometimes be assigned as quantitative values, for example, based on component failure rates, such as less than 1 in 1,000. But in the case of software failures, where estimating the probability of occurrence is extremely difficult, the decision of whether a risk is acceptable may be based on severity alone. Risk evaluation is carried out before and after risk control measures are applied. Normally, once risk control measures are implemented, the risk is reduced to an acceptable level. If a manufacturer determines that a particular risk is unacceptable under the criteria established in the risk management plan, and if no further risk control is practical, then a benefit risk analysis may be performed. This analysis is used to determine whether the expected benefits of the medical device, for its intended use, outweigh the residual risks. It is important to note that benefit risk analysis cannot be used as a business decision tool. It cannot be about financial profit or economic gain outweighing risk. A simple analogy comes from the field of pharmaceuticals. Even when side effects exist, the therapeutic benefit of the drug may justify its use. For medical devices, the benefits may be estimated from factors such as the expected performance of the device in clinical use, the clinical outcomes that performance can achieve, benefits gained from using comparable medical devices, and the risks and benefits of alternative diagnostic or therapeutic methods. For more detailed guidance on benefit-risk analysis, you can refer to ISO/TR 24971. Now, let's look at a case study of risk analysis, focusing on a recall incident involving the Care Innovations Health Harmony mobile telemedicine system. This system was designed so that patients could measure their vital signs, such as blood pressure, at home, and then send that data to their clinical team. The clinicians, in turn, could monitor the patient's health status and provide advice or instructions remotely. However, in certain situations, especially with special types of measurements, the patient data did not synchronize with the back-end database in a timely manner. As a result, the attending physician might not receive the latest patient data for 1 or even 2 days. The FDA classified this issue as a Class 2 recall. This means the problem could potentially cause adverse health consequences, but it was not considered a Class 1 event, which would involve a reasonable probability of serious injury or death. According to FDA documentation at the time, a design measure was under development to address the issue. Specifically, when the patient's tablet was synchronizing with the system, the application would prompt the patient to remain in the app until the upload was complete. This suggests that the problem likely occurred when patients closed the app too early, before the data transmission had fully completed. This case highlights how even small design details in telemedicine systems can have a direct impact on risk management and patient safety. Let's now perform a risk analysis of this telemedicine system. In this case, we will omit software-specific hazards since they are often difficult to identify directly. The sequence of events we are concerned with is this. Patient data, such as vital signs and health-related interactions with the physician, may not be transmitted to the physician's dashboard in a timely manner. This leads to the hazardous situation. The clinical team at the medical facility does not receive the patient's information, and as a result, the necessary diagnosis or treatment is not performed. The harm we must consider in the worst case is that the patient's condition deteriorates. The severity of this risk was judged to be serious, since the FDA classified this as a Class 2 recall. The probability was considered remote because it was not expected to occur frequently. Before risk control measures were implemented, this situation was considered unacceptable as it had already resulted in a recall. The risk control measure developed was, when the patient's tablet is synchronizing with the system, the app prompts the patient to remain in the application until the upload is complete. After applying this measure, the risk was judged acceptable. This example illustrates how, in the risk analysis phase, we document all key elements in a risk analysis table: the hazard, the sequence of events, the hazardous situation, the harm, the severity, the probability, the risk evaluation, the control measures, the residual risk judgment, and the supporting evidence. Risk analysis can be performed across different design domains, such as electrical, mechanical, software, or cybersecurity, as well as by product structure or by functional components. Over time, as new incidents or accidents are reported from the field, the volume of risk analysis data becomes very large. That is why it is essential to conduct continuous risk management throughout the entire product life cycle. In risk analysis, it is necessary to estimate both the probability that a hazardous situation will occur and the probability that this hazardous situation will lead to harm. For hardware failures, the probability can often be estimated. As shown in the figure on the upper left, hardware failures typically follow a bathtub curve over time, combining early failures, random failures, and wear-out failures. For usability-related errors, shown in the upper right, probabilities can also be estimated by analyzing the likelihood of user mistakes. However, software behaves differently. Software is invisible from the outside, and failures caused by software are not probabilistic. They occur systematically. These are known as systematic failures or faults, and unlike hardware failures, the probability of occurrence cannot be easily estimated. That is why failures and malfunctions caused by software are considered very difficult to predict using probability-based methods. Failures and malfunctions caused by software are known as systematic failures or systematic faults. These are defects that arise from software bugs, software-related issues, or even user operations, and because of their nature, it is very difficult to predict their failure rates in advance. A key characteristic of systematic failures and faults is that they are often not detected during final system testing before shipment. Instead, they are frequently discovered only after the product has been released and failures occur in the field. To address this, manufacturers must prevent the introduction of systematic failures and faults throughout the software development process and life cycle. This is done through careful design practices and by detecting and eliminating problems using verification and validation activities. As shown in the figure on the right, in the early stages of design, the focus is on preventing defects from being introduced. In the later stages, the focus shifts to detecting and removing defects before release, and across all stages, we apply verification to confirm that each step of the development process is correct, and finally, we use validation to confirm that the finished product truly meets the user's requirements. Now, let's talk about the concepts of safe design. On the left, we see the idea of individual optimization, which corresponds to fault avoidance. Fault avoidance is a design approach where safety is pursued by increasing the reliability of each individual component. In this mindset, failures or bugs in components are simply not allowed. On the right, we see the concept of overall optimization, which includes fail-safe, fault tolerance, and error-proofing, or foolproofing. Fail-safe means that even if individual components fail or contain bugs, the system will always settle into a safe state. In other words, safety is prioritized over reliability. Fault tolerance assumes that components may fail or contain bugs, but uses alternative means, such as redundancy or duplication, to maintain functionality. Error-proofing or foolproofing ensures that even if users attempt an incorrect operation, the system design prevents dangerous outcomes. This corresponds to risk management in usability. Simply stacking up improvements in the reliability of individual components, the individual optimization approach, cannot guarantee safety in large-scale, complex software systems. That is why an overall optimization approach is essential for safe system development, and it is especially well-suited for the development of large and complex medical device software. Yes, it is important to continue efforts to increase the reliability of individual software modules, but at the same time, the system must be designed with fail-safe, fault tolerance, and error-proofing concepts. Only with this overall optimization approach can we truly ensure the safety of modern medical devices. Next, let's look at some examples of practical methods for implementing safe design. For fault avoidance, examples include comprehensive verification and highly thorough testing, as well as formal methods, structured software development techniques that mathematically prove correctness. For fail-safe design, examples include protective measures, backup mechanisms, and dedicated safety devices that ensure the system always returns to a safe state in the event of a failure. For fault tolerance, we have software designs that use redundancy, such as spatial redundancy, temporal redundancy, or informational redundancy, to maintain functionality even when failures occur. And finally, for error-proofing or foolproofing, examples include easy-to-understand user interfaces, or features such as a home button, which help prevent dangerous situations even when users make mistakes. These methods illustrate how safe design concepts can be applied in practice to reduce risk and enhance the safety of medical device software. Finally, let's wrap up with a summary. Understand the concept of risk management in ISO 14971. In the 2019 revision, data and system security were explicitly included. Learn the terms and definitions used in risk management. Clarify safety-related characteristics and use the IMDRF code to anticipate hazardous situations and harms. Recognize that absolute safety cannot be defined. Products and services can only be relatively safe, so we must carry out continuous risk management. Conduct qualitative risk analysis and implement risk control measures to reduce risks to an acceptable level. And finally, understand the characteristics of software and design medical devices with safe design principles in mind. By applying these concepts, manufacturers can ensure compliance with ISO 14971 and contribute to the development of safer, more reliable medical devices.